Happy Valentine's Day. Have you ever wondered where that holiday came from? I did. Do you think its origins are from romantic encounters, or is the roots of that holiday a little more sinister? If you want to know, check out this episode. I have a great author coming in. He's going to tell us all about that. And then he's going to share some things that are bloody, scary, eerie, all tied to Valentine's Day. Check it out.
Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is the place where we talk about all things strange and unexpected in our reality. We are right around Valentine's Day, and did you know that the origin tales around Valentine's Day have quite a bit of strange and unexpected baked right into it? I know some of you will want to know a little more about that, just as I did when I read the cool book, The Scary Book of Valentine's Lore, 50 Terrifying Tales of Romance from Around the World. And to learn more about that today, I have one of my favorite authors on the show with us today, Tim Raybourn. Now, you might remember him from episode 49 back in December, where we talked about one of his other books, The Scary Book of Christmas Lore, and that was a fun and interesting interview. So with that, I want to welcome Tim back to the show and say, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm great, thanks. Glad to be back. I really enjoyed the last one, so looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And this was a fun book as well, which we'll get into. How have things been since we've last talked? Anything new going on?
Yeah, pretty good. I mean, this book came out. I'm actually just finished writing the third in the series, which I'll talk a little bit more about toward the end. It was really fun. It's a little different take this time, and it's going to be fun. It'll be out hopefully by the end of the year, so I think.
Nice. So
Yeah.
2025. Perfect.
Yeah, probably like October, November, I imagine, this year. Probably in time for the holidays, I would imagine.
Great.
So I'll chat a little bit more about that at the end.
Yeah. So before we hop into it, did you get anything fun done during the holidays? Do anything new or different?
Yeah. Does anyone?
I know, right?
No, I've been working on some new writing projects, and it's been good. I'm working on another one right now, so it's great. Yeah, keeps me going. So yeah,
That's what it's about.
yeah.
Now,
We actually didn't travel this year, so it was nice just to kind of stay home and not worry about the hassles of airports and any of that kind of thing. So
yeah, sometimes you have to take a break from that stuff because it actually, I feel like makes the holidays go faster. And I hate that. Yeah.
yeah, you want to stretch that out. I actually really enjoy that period of the year from sort of late November all the way through early January, and I want to kind of make it stretch out as long as possible. So
Right. Well, you live in California. You didn't have any of that? Oh, Washington.
I live in Washington State now. Yeah,
Okay,
we moved
that's
up here
right.
a few years ago. So
That's right. Okay, cool. Because I was going to ask, I'd just been with the fires last month.
Yeah.
I always want to ask because I hope anybody
Yeah.
I talk with wasn't impacted by that.
I mean, I have some friends that live down there. We used to live in the San Francisco area, but that's still very far north of Los Angeles. So
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, but I do have some friends. I had a few that had to evacuate. They were able to go back, but they weren't. Their houses weren't affected, but they did have to leave, for a while and then come back. So
Yeah.
I'm sure it's stressful and harrowing experience in its own way. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, to go through that is just got to be crazy. It's
yeah.
terrible.
Especially in the middle of winter, like you expect it's bad, but you kind of expect that in like maybe August or September or something, but not in January. That's what's so
Right.
great, crazy, and freakish about it. So yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
best to all those people. I know they're still trying to recover, a lot of them. So,
Absolutely. No,
yeah.
it's very rainy where we live, so we're not really in danger of that.
Yeah.
We get a lot of rain and a little bit of snow here.
Well, Tim, the Book of Scary Valentine's Lore.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Like,
Well, it's actually a sequel to the previous book, Scary Book of Christmas Lore, and I was asked to do it by the same publisher because that one was a good success for them. It sold really well and had a lot of great reviews. So they came back to me and asked me if I would do another one, and I said sure. And they said, well, how about doing Valentine's Day? I was like, okay, sure. It's not something I knew that much about, but as I jumped into it and started researching it, I found all sorts of really interesting stories. It was great fun. But yeah, I was asked to do it, and now basically I'm writing, as I said, a series of these. So it's really fun.
cool. Yeah, let's definitely get into that in a bit.
Yeah.
It was a fun book. I enjoyed reading it, and I never knew there was so much dark and bloodiness. around the origin of Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy. And that was probably one of my favorite parts of your book is how you set it up in the beginning. I learned so much, I think, in the first couple chapters
That was great.
that I didn't even know. So I was like,
Right.
oh, really? I'm like sharing it with my wife and different people. I said,
Right.
did you know? Did you know? And that's what it's
Yeah.
about.
When I started researching it, I knew some of these stories already, but one of the things, the first book, the Christmas lore book, is all about monsters. There's lots of like strange creatures of the night and witches and trolls and Krampus and all of those sorts of things. There are no Valentine's Day monsters. I
Right.
looked. Was really hoping there'd be like a Valentine's Day witch or troll or some sort of horrible, bugbear spirit thing that would like go out and devour children or something. But unfortunately, I didn't find anything like that. I wish
Yeah.
there were. There needs to be a tradition of like the Valentine's Day troll or something that rips people's hearts out. That would be, that would be perfect. But
It would.
we need to start one if there isn't one.
Right.
So I didn't have that option this time. So I had to look for a little bit more for some other things. I looked at much more in the way of mythology and history and actual like murder cases from history and tragics. I looked at also like urban legends. There's a lot of ghost stories. So I kind of tried to keep some of the same themes, but they were a little different this time. So I had to look for things, as you said, a little bit more bloody and tragic rather than scary monsters in the dark. And I thought, that was it. So it differs from the first book in that way. It's much
Yeah.
more human focus, I think, in this one. It's less about monsters. So there are ghosts. There's some great ghost stories, absolutely. But it's more about human beings being horrible to each other over the centuries. And there's some great myths as well, which are also about gods and humans being horrible to each other. So I thought that would be the way to link it all together, sort of crimes of passion and, murders and jealousy and adultery and betrayal and all those kinds of things for what I was really looking for this time. And I found them in abundance. So there were a lot of them. Tragedy, even just straight up tragedies. There's a lot of
it was amazing how much. So, would you take a few minutes and just kind of share a little bit about the start, the origin?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Valentine's Day itself is kind of a weird holiday that's obviously been co-opted by chocolate and greeting card companies, and a lot of people are very cynical about it, myself included. It's kind of a stupid fake holiday in a lot of people's opinions. The actual day, February 14th, was celebrated in the Roman Catholic Church for centuries as the feast of Saint Valentine, who was either one or possibly two or possibly three different people that actually lived in the third century or so, or he may not have existed at all. And he was a martyr in the early church. I'll read a little bit from the excerpts from that, but he died having his head chopped off in a fairly horrible way. So he was recognized as a sort of patron saint, as a saint early on. A lot of the early saints in the Catholic Church were these martyrs. They were people that died who were persecuted. They were shot full of arrows. They had their heads cut off. They were boiled in water, burned at the stake, crucified. You name it. There's like no end to the list of people that died of horrible executions. And Valentine was one of them. At least in his case, he was a Roman citizen, so he was given the merciful death of a quick beheading instead of being tortured to death. But it's an interesting story. Where Valentine's Day becomes associated with love is a little hard to tell. We think it was actually in the 14th century in England, actually in the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, the famous English writer, greatest writer in English before Shakespeare. And he wrote a poem called The Parliament of Fowls, meaning the Parliament of Birds, and it was meant as a kind of critique of the government of the time. But he has a line in there where he talks about how on February 14th, all of the birds assemble and the male birds try to attract mates. And it seems like there was this notion of, so there was already this sense at the time that it was a sign of early spring and that the birds were starting to flirt with each other and starting to do their calls and cries and such. So it seems like from about 1380 or so, around that time when he wrote the poem, then it started, at least in England and maybe France, started being associated as a day when lovers would exchange tokens. There's stories in the early 15th century of I think it was some English nobleman who he was in captivity in France, I think, and he sent like a letter back to his wife, and it was all sort of embroidered with all these beautiful flowers and things, and it was kind of like an early Valentine. A lot of people do. The story may or may not be true, but that's where it seems like that was perhaps the first Valentine that was sent to someone. But as far as the actual story goes, I'll read you a little bit from the actual book itself.
Okay.
Let me take a look here. Marked a few places in the book so that I could actually look at them. Valentine might have been Valentinus, a Catholic priest who lived in Rome, probably in the 2nd or 3rd century. At some point, he was arrested and held captive by a wealthy Roman named Asterius. While imprisoned, Valentinus would not talk with Asterius about his religion. According to the legend, Asterius told Valentinus that if he could cure Asterius's daughter of her blindness, he and his family would leave behind the Roman gods and embrace Christianity. Valentinus went to the girl and, so the story goes, restored her sight miraculously. Asterius was so impressed that he and his whole family also converted. But the Roman Emperor Claudius II heard about this healing and was furious. He ordered that Valentinus and Asterius, as well as his whole family, be executed. Their heads were cut off, and, that was the end for all of them. There's similar stories. There's another story that comes up in central Italy in the area of Umbria, which is just north of Rome. This time it was a bishop named Valentinus who convinced some high-ranking Romans to convert to Christianity. And there's another that says that Valentinus secretly performed marriages for Roman soldiers. Emperor Claudius II was convinced that unmarried men made better soldiers, so he outlawed marriages for his troops. But Valentinus went ahead and performed weddings for them anyway. And so off with his head. And then there's another legend that says that he helped Christians escape from Roman prisons, and he was found out and got the chop that way. There's even a legend that Valentinus himself sent a message of love to a young lady, signing it from your Valentine, from your Valentinus. Mm. That may also be one of the origins of that. So we don't really know. It's a mixture of sort of muddled history and urban legend, and we can't be sure what the actual story is, but it certainly has its origins in violence and people getting their heads cut off. So.
Yeah. It's amazing how many heads came off, right?
In every version, somebody loses their head.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, it's almost like a kind of like a comment. Cut his head off.
Be done with it, yeah.
You're right.
And there's a theory that Valentine's Day, it isn't quite the same as Christmas and solstice, but there was a Roman festival at the time called Lupercalia, if you remember reading about that.
Yeah,
which
I was going to ask
big,
you.
Wild, frenzied sort of procession through Rome in early February, and it was a feast of the wolf, and there were like unmarried women would be chased by unmarried men, and they would go through these kind of crazy rituals, and it was eventually banned even by the Roman emperors because it got out of hand and it encouraged rioting and violence and such. But it is curious that it occurs around the same time as this sort of early February, and I don't think there's a direct connection because Valentine's Day as a love holiday wasn't a thing until much, much later, so I don't think that the early Christian church tried to replace Lupercalia with a feast of St. Valentine. There's no evidence for that. But it is interesting that they did occur more or less at the same time, and it was kind of a festival of love and lust, in its own way. So there was this, I think, notion at the time that it's the first signs in the northern hemisphere of spring returning. In England, you'll see the snowdrops, which are called that because they literally push themselves up through the snow, and you'll go into these fields in England, and you'll see these little white flowers by the dozens popping up through snow if there's snow there. So, and that's hence their name. And it's a sign that spring is returning. So I think that is a kind of an early festival to sort of commemorate that. So the idea of love and fertility and spring and all of that, it was on people's minds. So I think these are both expressions of that kind of thing. It's Valentine's Day. Kind of, we have Groundhog Day here in America where we might have more winter or more spring. Valentine's Day, I think, also coincided with that. It's the first signs of spring. You're still a month and more than a month out until the spring equinox, but you're starting to see the signs already. Little flowers are coming up. In England, it's the daffodils and the snowdrops, and in other countries, certainly in a place like Italy, it's much warmer. It's more like California, so you're going to see signs of spring much earlier, and a lot of flowers and things would already be out by then. So spring comes earlier in the southern parts of Europe, for instance, or in America, for that matter. So, yeah.
And let's see, Henry VIII, around the 1500s is when he says, let's do this, right?
Yes, that's right. He actually made Valentine's Day an official holiday, which is an interesting thing. So, while he was busy either divorcing or executing his own wives. So, it's 6, by the way. So,
Oh, man, it's crazy.
Divorce. What was it? He divorced 2, executed 2, annulled the marriage to 1, and was outlived by the last. So, yeah.
History sometimes is better than anything else, isn't it?
It's amazing. I love it. Yeah.
Victorian vinegar Valentines.
Love those.
Yeah.
We need to bring that tradition back.
Right? Can you tell us about that? That was cool. Yeah.
So there was this tradition that grew up in the 1830s and 40s in Victorian England and Britain. about sending Valentine cards not only to people that you were in love with, but also people that you hated.
Yeah.
And the so-called vinegar Valentines were usually really snarky, really insulting, and you could send them to anyone. It could be an ex, it could be your terrible boss that fired you, it could be your landlord or your landlady, it could be a politician you didn't like, and often they were sent anonymously, so you could kind of say whatever you liked, and you could, say pretty much anything and get away with it, and unless you wanted them to know who you were. But they
Yeah.
were very popular for a good run of about 40, 50 years in Victorian England until toward the later 19th century. There was kind of a movement against them because they were seen as really cruel and crass and kind of really lowbrow, and there was a move that it just weren't polite. But there's instances of like people breaking out in fights. Apparently somebody shot a former spouse, was sent him one, and so it could actually turn very serious if
Yeah.
you didn't leave it anonymous. So, and the other funny thing about it is that they often sent them, even in those days, COD, which meant the recipient had to pay the postage to even open it. So they would have to pay a penny or whatever to the postman, and then they get this horrible card and open it up. So it just kind of added insult to injury. But they were. It's estimated that about, I think, greater than 50% of all Valentine cards sent in Victorian England at the height of this on that day were vinegar Valentines. So it was a real big industry for a while.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. People could enjoy it from both sides. Happy people.
Yes.
Just,
I think it's kind of a great idea, actually.
it really is. I can see it. It almost reminds me like an early version of like internet bullying or something.
Yeah. It is, and it could be that cruel and that unkind. So yeah, it is an interesting thing. Yeah. People have always, we think like online trolls are a new thing. People have always done stuff like this. Especially like anonymous bullying has always been an issue. So yeah. Or just hate mail has always been a thing. So yeah,
Right.
there are hate mail and bad reviews going all the way back. There was a great book many, many years ago by a music historian named Nicholas Slonimsky, and it was called The Lexicon of Musical Invective. And it was a history of bad reviews of concerts going back hundreds of years, like, back to the time of Beethoven and Mozart and such, and like the horrible. So people have always like said things in print that have just been horrible, to each other. And we think that's all new, but no, that human beings have a long history of snark and
Yeah, we've been nasty forever.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a very funny book, but yeah, you realize, oh, this is not new.
Yeah. And what's the name of the book again, in case people want
It's
to
called
pick it
The
up?
Lexicon of Musical Invective by Nicholas Slonimsky. It's still available on Amazon. So yeah, great
Nice.
fun. If you're interested in music history and want to read like really bad reviews of composers like Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Tchaikovsky, it's really funny. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I know in your book you talk about St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Which doesn't have a lot to do with Valentine's Day per se, but it's the infamous story of Al Capone and the bootlegging. And one of the things you find, of course, is that during Prohibition, the mob, of course, the mafia set up huge numbers of bootlegging operations, particularly in Chicago and New York and places like that. And Capone was a very wily, smart man in a lot of ways. He made a huge amount of money from bootlegging, absolutely. And it was estimated that his wealth in modern money was well over $1 billion. He was,
Wow.
super, super wealthy from crime organ. But the thing is that he maintained his home in Florida, so that he was always, he would come to Chicago, but he lived in Florida so that he could always kind of like have his hands technically off or whatever.
Yeah.
He would have this security measure there where any orders he gave didn't come from him directly. So the story about this is that it had to do with a rival gang that was starting to horn in on his territory in Chicago, and he decided they were doing their own bootlegging, and he decided to put an end to it. So he hired a bunch of hitmen who dressed up as cops. And they went to this warehouse where these guys were making whatever it was. It might have been whiskey, it could have been gin, who knows. They were making something, in their own illegal stills, but that was cutting into his profits. So these guys went there as cops, posed as cops, and when they got the guys to sort of give themselves up, they just opened fire and killed them all. And I think it was like 7 or 8 people they just sort of killed. There was one guy that was a survivor only because he was supposed to have been there earlier, but he got there later. And so he got there, and there was like this pile of bodies and blood everywhere, broken glass. They shot up all of the gin and everything else.
Wow.
Everything. So it was this horrendous mess of like blood and alcohol and things everywhere, and people were outraged, of course. But the one guy that went there He didn't know anything about it, or he said he didn't know anything about it. And Capone got off of it because there was no way to directly connect him to it. I mean, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and I think that looking at it historically now, people almost certainly say, yeah, he was the guy that ordered the hit. But this is why he was able to avoid that his whole life. The only thing that got him on, as you probably know, was tax evasion. They never
Oh,
were able to
crazy.
he was never actually got for murder or, bootlegging or anything else. Yeah, they got him on income tax evasion, so that was saying he was a smart guy, because what he would do is he took a portion of that money and he put it back into social charities in Chicago. He ran these soup kitchens and food kitchens and things that just fed thousands. I think at the height, one of them, the major operation, fed something like 10,000 meals 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner,
Wow.
absolutely free to anybody that wanted them. And this endeared him to the poor and the people. It was the middle of the Depression, and people were this was in the 30s, well after the Valentine's Day Massacre, which I think was in 28 or 29. Yeah, and people loved him because he was seen as a great, benefactor and social benefactor and hero. So he would make sure he put a lot of money into things like that to shore up his reputation. So yeah, he did some real genuine good. He kept a lot of people literally from starving to death for years there, but he was doing all this other stuff to earn that money to be able to pay for it. So,
Right.
but he was a hero to a lot of the lower class workers in Chicago because he took care of them. So yeah, it's a really interesting story.
So either caring or very smart. Either way, it worked
Yeah,
out.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He was a smart guy. Yeah, until the income tax thing. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, so
Well, it's
it became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre because it happened on that. And technically, it's never been solved. They have circumstantial evidence, but they've never been able to conclusively link him to it. So it's still technically one of the most notorious unsolved murders in U.S. history. So yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
That's our history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as we go through, these things in your book, what do you think were 2 or 3 of your favorite
Oh, I got
troubled
a lot.
and tragic love stories?
Yeah, this thing. Let me see. I bookmarked a few that I like to talk about. Let me
Cool.
see. What did I put in here? Oh, I love the Pyramus and Thisbe story. That's fantastic. That is, people, if they've read Shakespeare, will know this story. It's a kind of prototype Romeo and Juliet story. And in fact, Shakespeare not only wrote his version of Romeo and Juliet, of course, but he also managed to work Pyramus and Thisbe into another of his plays, Twelfth Night, not Twelfth Night, excuse me, Midsummer Night's Dream, where it actually goes horribly wrong and becomes part of the comedy. But the original story is quite bloody and horrible. It's an old Greek. But this version is actually by Ovid, who was a Roman writer who took a lot of Greek myths and rewrote them in the first century BC. So I'll just read a little bit about it. I'll just read the story. It's a classic sort of. It's a very Romeo and Juliet type of story with the same kind of tragic ending. Pyramus and Thisbe were a young couple who lived in neighboring houses in ancient Babylon. So it's actually set in Iraq, even though it was a Greek myth. Unfortunately for them, their parents hated each other, and they forbade their children from seeing each other. Rather than discouraging the young couple, the two found a way to communicate by speaking through a crack in the wall between their homes, and they declared their love for one another. But this wasn't enough for them, and they eventually concocted a plan to meet secretly by a tomb near a mulberry tree, and then flee from their families and enjoy their lives together. It might have worked, except that Thisbe arrived first. There she saw a lion who had just killed its prey, and its mouth was still bloody. Fearing for her own life, Thisbe ran away, but her cloak fell to the ground. The lioness gnawed and chewed on the cloak, leaving the blood from her jaws all over it. Pyramus arrived soon after, but saw Thisbe's torn and bloody cloak on the ground and the tracks that the lion had left. Pyramus assumed the worst, and overcome with grief and despair, he drew his sword and stabbed himself, his blood splashing on the white flowers of the mulberry tree. Thisbe returned to tell him what had happened and that she was all right, but she saw him lying dead at the base of the tree. Crying out in anguish, she prayed to the gods that the two of them might be buried together and be joined in death as they couldn't be in life. Then she took up Pyramus' sword and stabbed herself with it, lying down beside him to die. The gods heard her prayer, and as part of granting her wish, they turned the flowers of the mulberry tree red to signify the blood of these two faithful lovers had shed for each other. Of course, the story has obvious connections to Romeo and Juliet, which it influenced. So, yeah, Shakespeare managed to take a similar story as Romeo and Juliet, but put it into a comedy and have it go horribly wrong because the stage production goes horribly wrong at the end. But it was a very popular Greek story that was well known in ancient times, and it was it was the story of the sort of the tragedy of young love and the two families that hate one another. It's the old classic feuding families sort of story. So yeah, it's a good
Yeah.
one. Yeah, it's one of the originals.
It's good stuff. Yeah, I think how many times do we, in life have, we assume something and then we just go forward and do something and go,
Yeah.
oh, and then,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the extreme case, right?
Yeah.
I'll just kill myself. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's very melodramatic, and nobody would actually really do this in real life, but it makes a good story about not being impulsive. I think is the story. Be patient, be a little bit more. Let's look at this rationally. Let's try to find out what happened. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
But that would make for a good story. The good story comes from the drama and the suicide and the death and all of that. So yeah, that's what makes Romeo and Juliet the same kind of story. And I deliberately didn't put Romeo and Juliet in here because A, everybody knows it, and B, I wanted to do this story instead, so I left that out because everyone knows that. But it's essentially the same tropes, the same idea, a mistaken identity thing. You mistakenly think the person is dead, so so you kill yourself, and then they wake up or they come back and they see you're dead, so they kill themselves, and then everybody's dead. Yeah.
Well, when you put this book together, what did you enjoy most? Was there one part of it, or certain stories, or?
I like the historical ones, like the actual historical stories are interesting, the historical tragedies, and I love urban legends and ghosts. I always love anything to do with like ghost stories or urban legends, and there's some doozies in here which I absolutely love. Yeah, so those are the ones I really enjoyed the most. They're always good. But as a historian, I like searching out like actual real historical stories of real people and the things that went horribly wrong for them too. Like there's something weirdly kind of comforting about that for me in some ways. Is like knowing that. You can kind of take comfort in these sort of tragic stories. It's something that I think is really powerful and really interesting. But I do love the urban legends. I love the ghost stories. Those are always great because some of them are so over the top. The urban legends in particular are amazing. So yeah, I love those.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious, like before we, because there's a lot here for people to jump into, and we're just whetting their appetite, right?
Yes.
Go buy the book.
I hope.
I hope so. Yeah. And so my thought is there any one thing or any part of that book before we move away from it that you're like, people need to hear this or know this? Is there anything?
I mean, what I find interesting about the stories is the way so many of them are based around things like jealousy and miscommunication and misperception and mistaken identity and all of that kind of stuff. And so many of these stories actually do take those kinds of people taking things out of context or misunderstanding. I think one of the big takeaways from that is to try to be more understanding. I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it, like understand the other person's perspective, and you can avoid a lot of hassles and tragedy in your life, because so many of these stories are about that. They're miscommunications, misunderstandings, jealousies over things that aren't real, people flying off the handle, making rash decisions, all in the name of passion. And that's the whole point, is that love, many of the ancient Greek philosophers saw romantic love as almost a form of mental illness, because it made people act so irrationally. It could turn rational people, into murderers or liars or thieves or whatever, anything, so that they could acquire the object of their desire, and it's so they're like, there's a lot of ancient Greek philosophy about, is this even healthy? Is this something that's too dangerous for humanity to even have as a thing? Does it make people act too much like wild animals? Is it, so there's an interesting thing about that so much of that, love makes people stupid. And I think one of the messages of the book is, don't be stupid.
Yes.
Easily said, not easily done. But
right.
So much of these are about human fallacy and foibles and all of that, and how they screw things up because they allow their feelings to get the better of them instead of stepping back from them. And I think that's one of the key messages. So yeah, that's, if there's a theme to the book, that's what it is.
Yeah. And how many people in the world have either gotten themselves into a fight or even killed because they just can't control that passion for something or somebody?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can sit here in our chairs and say, oh, yes, well, we shouldn't have. But of course, we've all been there. We've all done it. This is the thing. So, there's nothing worse than getting rejected by somebody that you're interested in. It feels horrible. And there's nothing that, so we can all sit here and like, well, yes, I can have my mug and sit here, well, you see, we shouldn't be doing this. But that's, it's much easier said than done. But I think these stories are all examples, sometimes exaggerated and extreme, of how badly this can go wrong,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I'll share something that's kind of funny.
Sure.
When this was a bunch of years back, I had a guy working for me who fell head over heels in love with this girl.
Uh-huh.
He could not focus at all.
Yeah.
Like, we would be talking to him in the department, about something, and he was just like, we were like,
Oh, poor guy.
hey,
Yeah. Over here.
back here. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And at one point, it was like, because I was his manager, I was like, do you need to take some time off? It was crazy. So people do crazy things
Yeah.
over those feelings.
Absolutely. And we think we're over that once we're maybe past our mid-20s or something, but absolutely not. You know, we think this is a teenage thing, or maybe 15 to 25, but it's not. It really isn't. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that, the biological urges and imperatives are so strong and so baked into our brain stems that it's not something that goes away. So that's why we keep telling stories like this, I think.
Yeah.
Is sort of, get that out and, and sort of externalize it in a way that we can talk about it and rationalize it or understand it better. Yeah.
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 Well, around this Valentine holiday and things, are you aware of any events, festivals, or anything like that are out there? I mean,
I'm not. That's a good question. I probably should have done a little research on that. There isn't anything like the Christmas and winter holidays have all the Krampus festivals, particularly in the
right.
United States and Europe now, and there's other things in various parts of the world. I'm not aware of that. I know that there are a few other things that happen around the time, but they're not really Valentine's Day related. Like I said, the Lupercalia celebration may have been that. So there are springtime celebrations, but I'm not actually aware of anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any equivalents of sort of Krampus type celebrations, but for Valentine's Day. There might be. It's an interesting question. It's not something I actually thought about when I was putting the book together, so I should go and look at that, actually, and see what's out there. There probably are. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there's like, some sort of like Valentine's Day ghost tours, or
Right.
touring tragic homes of like murders and two lovers who now haunt the house. It wouldn't surprise me if there's stuff. I'm sure there are things like that out there, or Edgar Allan Poe evenings of reading things or whatever, set on the day. And that, yeah, I'm sure there are things, but in terms of like bigger organized things, I'm not aware of those.
Yeah.
There may well be, but I don't know, I'm afraid.
Well, we might be giving people ideas right
Yeah,
now.
please go out and start something. Start a whole, tradition of Valentine's Day ghost parades or something. That would
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I wasn't aware of the Krampus stuff. And then when we talked last time, I was like, really? So it was kind of cool to see that. So I was curious.
There's a whole bunch of websites. I think there's one just called Krampus USA or KrampusAmerica.com that lists all of the festivals. And they usually start sort of mid-November and go on till like early January, but there's a lot of them, which they're great and they're a lot of fun. So
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of anything like that for Valentine's Day, not that I've seen. So
Yeah.
I could well be wrong. Somebody could, write in later and say, hey, you should check out this place and wherever,
Right. Please. People
I'd love
do
to hear
that.
about it. Yeah.
That would be cool.
Yeah. There's a perfect sort of pink lighting background too. This is like an appropriate lighting for the day in the back there. So,
Yes. On purpose.
yes, that's great.
Well, it's I worked for a company before that they would do Valentine's. What was it? It was like a masquerade dance.
Oh,
It was
I like
pretty
that.
cool. I thought it was really neat, and the company did a good job
Yeah.
with certain holidays doing stuff like that. So it was a fun thing I hadn't seen other places.
Yeah.
So
It is
people should do
interesting
that.
that it feels like I was a kid in the 70s, a teenager in the 80s. It feels to me like it was a little bit of a bigger deal even in like public schools in the 70s. You had to like give Valentines to everybody in your class. You had to like
Yeah.
cut up little things in red or pink construction paper and write why you liked that person, and you had to give one to everyone in your class. That I seem to remember that being a thing, and
Me too.
I don't think that's really a thing anymore. It's interesting that was like, it was kind of forced fun, but we all had to do it, and it was
Yeah.
something. I remember a few years at least in grade school and like 76, 77, 78 doing something like that. So yeah, when I was
I do
very
remember that.
yeah.
I'll have to see if my grandkids do anything like that. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out. Yeah, I don't know that that's even still a thing anymore. It's potential for things like harassment complaints and other things like that, I suppose.
True. Yeah,
Killed it a
'cause
long time
something
ago.
could be
It was
misunderstood.
something. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
you were saying.
No, it's something that it was really more like young kids. I remember doing it in like second, third grade, maybe fourth grade. It wasn't really much beyond that, I don't think. So, but it was, yeah, I do have distinct memories of that being a thing. That was like a class project we all had to do,
Yeah.
either on the day before or the day of or whatever. Yeah.
Well, what do you have coming down the pike?
As I say, I'm working on a couple new books. As always, I've always got projects. As Yeah, I could mention a little bit about the next book in the series, which is
Yeah.
great fun. It is the Scary Book of Fairy Tales, and I just finished
Ooh.
writing it. And it's if you know anything about the original Grimm's fairy tales, they are pretty grim. They are horrible. And so I looked at a bunch of those. The original German versions, which are not the Disney versions, I can absolutely assure you,
Right.
they're really horrible. And some of those, a lot of those deal with like stories of love and loss, and some of those stories could have easily gone in here. But I'm glad I didn't include them because now I got to put them in that. So that's going to be coming up. I just finished that book. I handed it in, submitted it a few weeks ago, and I think it's going to be out in like I'm guessing like October, November, something like that. I don't
Perfect.
know the release date, but yeah. So it's going to look at the Grimm's fairy tales, but also some of the other European ones. It looks at a lot of folk tales from around the world, and a lot of them are just like they're really intense and violent and bloody and yeah, it's really not what people think fairy tales are. If they only know like the Disney versions and the Dreamscape versions and things like that, those are very sanitized versions of stories that were originally meant for children back in the early like, 18th and 19th centuries, but are very dark. So yeah,
Yeah,
so I have
that's
a
kind of a
lot.
crazy thing.
Mhm.
Why would we tell our kids that, right? Keep
Yeah,
them in
well,
line, I guess.
my theory about it, and it kind of goes back even to the Valentine's Day thing, is that those stories were meant as teaching tools. They were meant as like, and just like I think we even talked about this in the Christmas book as well.
Hmm.
The witch that lives in the forest that can eat you is just really a metaphor for don't go into the forest alone. You could die. You could a wild animal, a wolf could eat you, a big cat could eat you. Bandits live in there. They could slit your throat and steal your money. So there was this always these things are the notion of, and it applies to the Valentine's Day too thing about you know there's a line between human civilization and the other, and there's dangers out there, but the safety is here. In this village, in this town, in this castle, wherever, if you're here, you're much more likely to avoid the dangers that are out there. And I think all of these stories have that kind of thing. Whereas love itself is a little more insidious because love can get inside. The monster may be able to you may be able to keep the monster out at the wall, but you can't stop the jealousy if somebody's in love with somebody else's wife. That's going to get in no matter what. So there's an added layer of that to that. And I think a lot of these stories are reminders of those sorts of things. It's yeah, you can keep out the troll, but can you keep out the passionate lover that will do anything to be with the person that they're crazy about? There's a real danger there, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
the Valentine's Day stories actually kind of speak to that. That nothing is going if two people want to be together, nothing is going to stop them, and if somebody is obsessed enough with somebody else, it's likely nothing is going to stop them from doing something stupid, and no fence, no wall, or anything is going to keep that out. So it actually differs a little bit from the others, but the idea is the same: is that there are these hidden dangers that one needs to be on the lookout for. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Well, and it extends to not just humans. I was talking to somebody recently, and they were talking about what we would think about the primate groups, monkeys.
yeah.
And usually
Chimpanzees and yeah,
there's like a
gorillas.
dominant one there, right? That kind of exercises
Yeah,
dominance. Well,
often.
they did some DNA checking on some of these groups, and they found out that up to 60% of the offspring that were born were not from the dominant one.
Interesting, right?
Yeah, isn't
Yeah,
that crazy? So nothing can stop what you really want to happen, I
yeah.
guess.
Yeah, it is interesting that we look at those things and we're rightly repulsed by them, whether it's like affairs or rape or any of those things. But from an evolutionary point of view, they make sense, and that's an uncomfortable thing to sit with. Like
Yeah,
the male that can spread his genes around the most is the one that wins. So if a dominant male or whatever can get in and impregnate all the females in another tribe or another herd or whatever, they're winning biologically and evolutionarily speaking, and that's an uncomfortable thing for us to sit with, but that's what our biology tells us, and it's so
right.
we may be very offended by that and think it's horrible, and it is, but that's I think again that's at the root of some of these stories as well, is that there's that unease about these things, that wild passion or wild romantic feelings is a little bit too close to what evolution might have actually intended for certain primate species and such. So it's interesting. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, you're one of the things I've noticed about the two books that we've talked about, the Christmas one and this one,
Mhm.
really cool graphics, the
Yeah.
cover, everything like that.
Yeah.
Is that do you have an artist that you work with who does this? Or
It's an artist that it's the same artist did both, which and I think
yeah,
he's doing the third as well. It's someone that HarperCollins works with, and they assigned him to work on my book, so it's
yeah,
great. I corresponded with him, but I don't have any control over those. So the cool thing is that what I usually do, like with the last book, with the fairy tale book, I sent them a list of like a synopsis or summary of all the stories I was going to include, with links to where he could read them online, so that he can then choose. And then he sent me back a list of all the ones he wants to illustrate, and I made some corrections based on whether or not the pictures were going to be accurate enough to the stories and
hmm.
whatever. But so it's really fun, yeah. But I don't actually get to see those until the book is published. They're not really sending me those ahead of
Oh
time, so
wow.
I
So
don't
you
see
get
them
to be
until
surprised too,
maybe
huh?
like a preview on the website or something. But I don't get to see most of them until I actually open the book for the first time. So it's
Wow.
kind of scary, but kind of fun actually.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. His stuff is so good that I know he's going to do a fantastic job. So opening the Valentine's Day book when I did get it back in December was a real pleasant surprise. Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, he did. Oh, he did that one. Fantastic. So yeah, yeah,
Well, that's why I was asking because I think it's really well done. So
yeah,
it's something cool to look at as
yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like that. That
absolutely.
really comes alive by having those there, and I'm really appreciative that they found somebody that could do such a good job with it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, look, we've had a good one here, and we've whet some people's appetite, I
I hope
think,
so.
to check this out. Anything else you wanted to say about this this current book or any work that you're
I,
doing? Or
yeah, I mean, if you like the previous book, Christmas Lore, you'll probably like this one. The focus is a little different. It's more on murder and death and jealousy and revenge and all those things. But there's some really cool ghost stories and urban legends. And like one of my favorites is the Japanese Slashmouth. I don't know if you remember that one. There's like a horrendous urban legend ghost story where people have reported seeing this creep. Nobody does ghosts like horrifying ghosts like the Japanese. They have like the most terrifying ghost stories
right.
everywhere. And this one is the one where they see this sort of once beautiful ghost of a once beautiful young woman whose like mouth is like cut up all the way to the side. And the story goes that it was like either her husband or someone who loved her was a dentist or a surgeon or something, and it slashed her that way. So she now roams dark places like old abandoned train stations and alleyways and such. And if she comes upon somebody, she'll be wearing a mask, and she takes the veil off and says like, "Do you think I'm pretty?" And no matter what you say, basically she will stab you to death with a pair of scissors. And
There's no right
apparently the
answer.
only way you can get out of it is if you say, "I'm late for an appointment," and then she will apologize to you, because apparently, Japanese politeness. She's like, "Oh, sorry, never mind," and you can get away. But yeah, but
I
almost
love
anything you say, whether yes, no, I don't know, you'll get stabbed or your throat will be slashed or something. So yeah, it's just horrifying. And there's a great visual for it. It's a fantastic painting that he did in the book
it.
for it as
Really.
well. So yeah, but it was like it had to do with she was killed by someone who was obsessed by her, like romantically, sexually obsessed with her, and yeah. So now she's trying to take her revenge eternally by stabbing and slashing people's throats to make them look like her or whatever. So yeah,
Mm,
it's yeah. The Japanese are just on another level when it comes to horror and ghosts and such. They're just fantastic stories. So yeah, yeah. I don't know how we
that
got
would be
off on that.
fun.
You were just saying, anything else people want to know about the book, but there's some good ghost stories in there. There's some great urban legends, and yeah, a lot of fun stuff. So yeah. So
Well,
if
there
you
you
like the
go.
first book, you'll probably like this one. I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, people now they've got something to look forward to right around Halloween
Yeah.
and that sort of
It's
thing.
it's only 10 days till Valentine's Day. You've still got time.
Yeah,
Have a romantic dinner and then read horrible stories back and forth to each other out of the book.
yeah. Why not, right? Come up with a little tradition.
That'd be a good one. I like that. Yeah, yeah.
Well, Tim, how can people continue to follow your work and to tie into things?
Sure. Just my website is just timraybourn.com. Always happy to have people come and look. You can sign up for a mailing list there if you would like. I've been really bad about keeping mailing list regular. It's one of those things that I don't like to spam people and I don't want to send too often. I'm going to start getting better about doing regular things. So if you want to go and sign up for it, that would be fantastic. Yeah, timraybourn.com. All of my books, the music I've done in the past are there, upcoming projects. So yeah, yeah. I try to make it fun and a little funny so that there's things for people to read and look at there. Other than that, you can find me on Blue Sky and still on various meta platforms. I don't know for how much longer because I don't like their privacy things and what they're doing. But right now,
Yeah,
I'm online in various places. So yeah, yeah,
just check. Yeah, just look. I mean, you're easy to find things. So
yeah, yeah. You
yeah,
search my name on Amazon, my author page will come up. It's easy. It's got all my other books there. So or Barnes & Noble, same thing. Barnes & Noble actually carries a number of these books in store too, so you can even ask for them there if you go there. It's always good to order. Like your local bookshops, if you want to buy this or the Christmas book, go to your local bookshop, and if they don't have it, order it. It's great to give them business, and it actually really helps. So it's always a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Well, there you go. This was awesome. I really appreciate the time we got together.
Yeah,
people, take a look at this book, add it to your collection, and hey, we just gave you a great idea. Go out for dinner, buy a rose, and sit down and read this together. It'd be awesome.
Hopefully a black shriveled rose,
Yeah. There will be some ladies that will really like that. So
yeah, I
that'd be
hope
pretty
so.
cool.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Please do.
So as we wrap up here, I hope that everybody out there has a terror-free and loving and romantic Valentine's Day.
Oh no, it should be totally scary and terrifying. That would be much more fun.
I agree. But with all that, stay alert, because there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So always keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe. Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you. Love it.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.